15 years ago, on October 23, 2007, Marcus Williams clocked out of Creole Dreams restaurant for the last time. The 37-year-old executive chef, beloved by his staff and respected throughout New Orleans' culinary scene, vanished into the humid night air of the French Quarter, leaving behind nothing but questions and a family shattered by his absence. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. That Tuesday night started like any other in the bustling kitchen of Creole Dreams. Marcus had just finished supervising the dinner service, his signature jambalaya earning rave reviews from tourists and locals alike. Security cameras captured him leaving through the staff exit at 11:47 p.m., walking toward Royal Street, where he'd parked his burgundy Honda Civic. The car was found 3 days later, abandoned in a Walmart parking lot in Metairie, keys still in the ignition. Marcus's disappearance plunged his pregnant wife, Angela, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, into a nightmare from which they would never fully awaken. Angela, 7 months pregnant at the time, went into premature labor just 5 days after Marcus vanished. Their son, Michael, would grow up knowing his father only through faded photographs and stories told through tears. The New Orleans Police Department, still overwhelmed by post-Katrina chaos, initially treated Marcus as just another missing adult. Detective Ray Broussard, the lead investigator, explored several theories: voluntary disappearance due to financial stress, involvement with drugs, or even suicide. The restaurant industry was notorious for its high-pressure environment, and Marcus had been working double shifts to support his growing family. But Angela Williams knew better. Her husband wasn't the type to abandon his responsibilities. Marcus was a devoted father who read bedtime stories to Sophia every night he wasn't working late. He was planning to expand Creole Dreams with his business partner, Jerome Baptiste, and had just put a deposit down on a larger house in mid-city for their expanding family. The investigation revealed troubling gaps. Marcus's cell phone was never found. His bank accounts remained untouched. There were no withdrawals, no credit card transactions, no digital footprints of any kind after that October night. It was as if Marcus Williams had simply evaporated into the humid Louisiana air. Community members organized search parties that combed the French Quarter, the Mississippi riverfront, and even the still damaged neighborhoods left in Katrina's wake. Flyers with Marcus's smiling face appeared on every street corner, in every shop window. The local news covered the story for weeks, but as time passed and no leads emerged, public attention faded. The Williams family, however, refused to let Marcus become just another cold case statistic. They knew the truth was out there, buried somewhere in the labyrinthine streets and hidden corners of New Orleans. What they didn't know was that the answer would remain hidden for 15 long years, waiting in the shadows like a ghost haunting the city's conscience. The months following Marcus Williams's disappearance transformed from urgent investigation to quiet desperation. By spring 2008, Detective Broussard's caseload had swollen with new crimes, and Marcus's file began gathering dust in the NOPD's archives. The official stance became increasingly clear. Marcus Williams had likely chosen to disappear. Angela Williams watched her world crumble in slow motion. 7 months after giving birth to Michael, she returned to work as a nurse at Oxner Medical Center, struggling to support 2 children on a single income. The house Marcus had dreamed of buying became an impossible fantasy. Instead, Angela moved herself and the children into a cramped apartment in Algiers, across the river from the French Quarter, where her husband had vanished. Sophia, now 9, began asking harder questions. "Mama, why didn't Daddy come to my school play? When is Daddy coming home?" Each question was a knife twist in Angela's heart. How do you explain to a child that sometimes people just disappear? How do you maintain hope when the world seems to have forgotten? The restaurant industry, tight-knit and gossipy as it was, buzzed with theories. Some whispered that Marcus had gambling debts. The city's underground poker scene was notorious for violent collection methods. Others suggested he'd been dealing drugs, using Creole Dreams as a front. A few cruel voices even insinuated that Angela knew more than she was letting on. Jerome Baptiste, Marcus's business partner and best friend since culinary school, became an unexpected pillar of support for the family. Jerome had co-founded Creole Dreams with Marcus in 2005, and the restaurant's success was built on their shared vision of elevating traditional Creole cuisine. After Marcus's disappearance, Jerome took over full operations, ensuring the restaurant survived while quietly setting aside Marcus's share of the profits in a trust fund for Sophia and Michael. But Jerome carried his own burden of guilt. The last conversation he'd had with Marcus had been tense, a disagreement about expanding the restaurant's catering business. Marcus wanted to move cautiously. Jerome pushed for aggressive growth. They'd argued in the kitchen that Tuesday afternoon, harsh words exchanged in the heat of service pressure. Jerome would replay that conversation countless times, wondering if their friendship had truly been as strong as he'd believed. Detective Broussard officially closed the active investigation in December 2009, 2 years and 2 months after Marcus vanished. The case was reclassified as a cold case, filed away with hundreds of others in the NOPD's overwhelmed system. Angela received the notification by mail, a form letter explaining that, while the case would remain open, no active investigative resources would be dedicated to finding her husband. The years blurred together in a haze of grief and survival. Sophia excelled in school but struggled with abandonment issues, flinching whenever Angela was even a few minutes late picking her up. Michael grew into a quiet, observant boy who studied every man who entered their lives, searching for clues about the father he'd never known. Angela never remarried, though well-meaning friends and family frequently suggested it was time to move on. How could she move on when she didn't know if Marcus was dead or alive? How could she explain to potential partners that she was still married to a ghost? By 2015, 8 years after the disappearance, even Angela's family began gently suggesting that perhaps it was time to have Marcus declared legally dead. The insurance money could help with the children's college funds. A death certificate would provide closure, they argued, but Angela refused. Dead meant gone forever, and she wasn't ready for forever. The French Quarter continued its eternal dance of tourists and locals, jazz music and cooking aromas. Creole Dreams thrived under Jerome's management, becoming one of the most recommended restaurants in the city. But Marcus's office remained exactly as he'd left it, his chef's jacket hanging on the door, his collection of vintage cookbooks gathering dust, a framed photo of his family smiling from the desk. New Orleans had moved on. The world had moved on, but in a small apartment in Algiers, a woman and her 2 children held onto hope like a lifeline, refusing to let a good man's memory disappear into the city's countless unsolved mysteries. They had no way of knowing that 15 years later, the truth would finally surface in the most unexpected place, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look. 15 years of silence shattered on a humid Tuesday morning in July 2022. Patricia Menendez, a real estate developer clearing out abandoned properties in the Marigny neighborhood, made a discovery that would reopen one of New Orleans' most haunting cold cases and expose secrets that had festered in the shadows for over a decade. The property at 1247 Dauphine Street had been empty since Hurricane Katrina. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Estelle Thibodeau, had died in 2019, leaving the shotgun house to distant relatives who wanted nothing more than to sell it quickly. Patricia's team was doing routine cleanup when they discovered a false wall in what had once been the kitchen pantry. Behind that wall, in a space barely large enough for a person to stand, workers found a collection of items that made Patricia immediately call the police. A chef's jacket embroidered with Marcus Williams, Executive Chef, a wallet containing a Louisiana driver's license, and most disturbing of all, a leather-bound recipe notebook filled with Marcus's handwriting and dark stains that would later be confirmed as human blood. NOPD detective Lisa Champagne, a 15-year veteran who specialized in cold cases, arrived at the scene within an hour. Unlike the overwhelmed department of 2007, the modern NOPD had dedicated resources for exactly these situations. Detective Champagne immediately recognized the significance of the find and ordered a full forensic investigation of the property. The recipe notebook was particularly haunting. Marcus had been working on a cookbook project before his disappearance, documenting traditional Creole recipes passed down through generations of New Orleans families. The pages were filled with his meticulous notes. Add okra slowly to prevent clumping. Mrs. Baptiste's secret. Always bloom the spices first. Remember, roux is patience made visible. But scattered throughout the culinary notes were entries that didn't belong, fragments of conversations, names, dates. One entry, dated October 20th, 2007, just 3 days before Marcus vanished, was particularly chilling. Jay knows about the missing money. Confrontation inevitable. If something happens to me, look closer at the books. The truth is in the numbers. Angela Williams received the call at 2:30 p.m. while she was working her shift at Oxner. Detective Champagne's voice was gentle but professional. "Mrs. Williams, we've found some items that belong to your husband. I'd like you to come down to the station when you can." 15 years of held breath released in a sob that echoed through the hospital corridor. Colleagues who had watched Angela carry her grief with dignity for over a decade gathered around her, understanding that this call, whatever it contained, would change everything. Sophia, now 23 and working as a teacher in Jefferson Parish, rushed to meet her mother at the police station. Michael, 15, and bearing an uncanny resemblance to the father he'd never known, was pulled out of summer school. The family that had waited so long for answers was finally going to get them, though they couldn't have imagined how devastating those answers would be. The discovery at 1247 Dauphine Street made the evening news across Louisiana. Break in 15-year-old missing chef case dominated local headlines. Jerome Baptiste, now a successful restaurateur with 3 establishments, watched the coverage from his office at Creole Dreams, his hands trembling as he recognized Marcus's handwriting on the notebook pages shown on screen. The notebook's final entry, dated October 23, 2007, the day Marcus disappeared, was barely legible, written in what appeared to be desperate haste. "Meeting at Estelle's tonight. This ends now. If I don't make it home, tell Angela and Sophia I love them. The guilty conscience is the cruelest punishment of all." Detective Champagne knew she was looking at more than just a missing person case now. The blood evidence, the hidden location, and most importantly, Marcus's own words painted a picture of premeditation and betrayal. Someone Marcus trusted had lured him to that house on Dauphine Street. Someone Marcus trusted had killed him there. The question wasn't whether Marcus Williams was dead. The evidence made that tragically clear. The question was who had murdered him, and why they'd managed to keep their secret buried for 15 years, while a family slowly broke apart, waiting for answers. What Detective Champagne didn't yet know was that the killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, continuing to live and work in the very community that had mourned Marcus's disappearance. The investigation was about to expose a web of financial fraud, personal betrayal, and cold-blooded murder that would shock New Orleans to its core. The truth, as Marcus had written in his final entry, was indeed in the numbers, and after 15 years of silence, those numbers were finally going to tell their story. Detective Lisa Champagne had seen enough cold cases to know that money was often the root of murder, and Marcus Williams's cryptic notebook entries about missing money and the books pointed her investigation in a direction that would unravel 15 years of carefully constructed lies. The forensic accounting team arrived at Creole Dreams on a sweltering Wednesday morning in August 2022. Jerome Baptiste, now 42 and considerably more prosperous than he'd been in 2007, watched nervously as investigators carried boxes of financial records from the restaurant's office. His lawyer, Thomas Hebert, a sharp-dressed man from one of New Orleans' most prestigious firms, shadowed every move. "This is harassment," Hebert complained to Detective Champagne. "My client has been nothing but cooperative. He's the one who helped keep this investigation alive by preserving Marcus's office for 15 years. But Champagne had learned to distrust excessive cooperation. In her experience, the loudest protesters of innocence often had the most to hide. The notebook entries suggested Marcus had discovered financial irregularities shortly before his death. If true, it meant someone had been stealing from the restaurant, and Marcus had confronted them about it. The financial records painted a troubling picture. In the months leading up to Marcus's disappearance, Creole Dreams had experienced unusual cash flow problems despite strong sales figures. Large cash deposits that should have appeared in the bank statements were missing. Vendor payments were delayed. Most suspicious of all, a series of consulting fees totaling $47,000 had been paid to a company called Bayou Consulting LLC between June and October 2007. Forensic accountant Maria Santos discovered that Bayou Consulting was a shell company registered to an address that turned out to be a UPS store mailbox in Metairie. The company's sole owner, according to Louisiana state records, was one E. Thibodeau, the same Estelle Thibodeau who had owned the house where Marcus's belongings were found. The web of connections was becoming impossible to ignore. Jerome Baptiste had access to the restaurant's finances. Estelle Thibodeau owned the house where evidence was hidden. The shell company bearing her name had received mysterious payments from the restaurant, and Marcus's own words suggested he'd discovered the theft and planned to confront someone about it. Angela Williams sat across from Detective Champagne in the station's interview room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. For 15 years, she'd imagined this moment, finally getting answers about Marcus's disappearance. She'd never imagined those answers would be so devastating. "Mrs. Williams, I need to ask you about Jerome Baptiste," Champagne said gently. "Did Marcus ever express concerns about him? Any business disputes or financial disagreements?" Angela's laugh was bitter. Jerome was Marcus's best friend. He stood up at our wedding. He held Sophia when she was baptized. After Marcus disappeared, Jerome made sure we never wanted for anything. He paid for Sophia's school supplies, helped with my car payments when I was struggling. She paused, the weight of realization settling on her shoulders. "You think Jerome killed my husband?" The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Phone records showed that Jerome had called Marcus at 10:15 p.m. on October 23, 2007, just over an hour before Marcus left the restaurant for the last time. The call lasted 7 minutes. When investigators asked Jerome about it, his story had changed 3 times, first claiming he didn't remember any call, then saying it was about restaurant business, finally admitting they'd discussed meeting later that night. Estelle Thibodeau, it turned out, had been Jerome's great-aunt. The elderly woman had suffered from dementia in her final years, making her an easy target for manipulation. Neighbors remembered Jerome visiting her frequently in the months before Katrina, often carrying cleaning supplies and construction materials. After the storm, when most of the neighborhood was evacuated, Jerome would have had unlimited access to her empty house. The timeline was becoming clearer. Jerome had been embezzling money from Creole Dreams, using his aunt's identity to create a shell company that allowed him to steal thousands of dollars from the restaurant he and Marcus had built together. When Marcus discovered the theft, Jerome lured him to his aunt's house under the pretense of discussing their partnership. What happened next was murder. Dr. Patricia Fontenot, the Orleans parish coroner, examined the blood evidence found in Marcus's notebook. The pattern suggested close contact violence, droplets consistent with blunt force trauma rather than defensive wounds. "This blood spatter tells a story," Dr. Fontenot explained to the investigation team. "The victim was struck multiple times at close range. The killer would have been covered in blood." Jerome's behavior in the days following Marcus's disappearance now took on sinister significance. Employees remembered him arriving at work the morning after Marcus vanished with fresh scratches on his hands, claiming he'd been doing yard work. He'd immediately taken control of the restaurant's finances, explaining that Marcus had given him temporary authority before taking some time away. Most damning of all, Jerome had insisted on handling the restaurant's insurance claim when Marcus was declared legally dead in 2018. The policy paid out $250,000 to the business, money that Jerome claimed was needed for renovations and expansion. Those renovations had never materialized, but Jerome's personal wealth had grown considerably in the years following the payout. Detective Champagne knew she was close to solving a 15-year-old murder, but she needed more than circumstantial evidence. Jerome Baptiste was a respected businessman with deep ties to the New Orleans community. His restaurants employed dozens of people. His charitable work was well documented. Arresting him would require ironclad proof that he'd killed his best friend and business partner. The breakthrough would come from an unexpected source: modern DNA technology that hadn't existed in 2007, and a killer's arrogance in believing his secret was buried forever. The blood on Marcus's notebook was about to tell its own story, one that would finally give the Williams family the justice they'd waited 15 years to receive. Jerome Baptiste had built his success on his best friend's grave, but his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him like a house of cards in a Louisiana hurricane. The DNA results arrived on a Friday afternoon in September 2022, carried in a manila envelope that would finally provide the scientific proof Detective Champagne needed to solve Marcus Williams's murder. The blood found on the recipe notebook contained 2 distinct DNA profiles: Marcus Williams and Jerome Baptiste. Jerome's explanation for how his DNA ended up mixed with Marcus's blood was fumbling and contradictory. First, he claimed they'd had a minor kitchen accident weeks before Marcus disappeared. Then he suggested the blood might have been from an old cut that had reopened. Finally, faced with the impossibility of explaining away the evidence, Jerome's expensive lawyer advised him to stop talking entirely, but the investigation had developed its own momentum. Search warrants for Jerome's home and businesses uncovered a paper trail that revealed the full scope of his betrayal. Hidden in a safety deposit box at Whitney Bank were documents showing that Jerome had been systematically stealing from Creole Dreams for over 2 years before Marcus's death. The theft totaled more than $180,000, money that should have gone toward the restaurant's expansion and the Williams family's future. Even more damaging was Jerome's personal journal, discovered in a locked desk drawer in his Garden District home. The entries, written in Jerome's careful handwriting, read like a confession 15 years in the making. March 15, 2007. Took another $3,000 today. Marcus is getting suspicious about the cash shortfalls. I have to be more careful. August 22, 2007. The shell company is working perfectly. Aunt Estelle doesn't even know I'm using her name. The old woman barely remembers her own address most days. October 20th, 2007. Marcus knows. He's been going through the books, asking questions about Bayou Consulting. Says he wants to meet this weekend to discuss irregularities. I'm running out of time and options. The final entry, dated October 24th, 2007, the day after Marcus disappeared, was the most chilling. It's done. Marcus won't be asking any more questions. I never wanted it to come to this, but he left me no choice. The restaurant will be mine now. I just have to stay calm and let the police chase their own tails. Angela Williams read portions of the journal in Detective Champagne's office, her hands shaking as she absorbed the casual cruelty of Jerome's words. The man who had comforted her in her grief, who had helped pay for her children's needs, who had preserved Marcus's office as a shrine to their friendship, that same man had murdered her husband for money. He played the grieving business partner for 15 years, Angela whispered, tears streaming down her face. He came to Marcus's memorial service. He helped me move apartments. He gave Michael money for his first car. The betrayal cut deeper than the murder itself. Jerome hadn't just killed Marcus. He'd tortured the family with false kindness while hiding his crime. The arrest came on October 23, 2022, exactly 15 years after Marcus Williams disappeared. Jerome Baptiste was taken into custody at Creole Dreams during the busy dinner service, led away in handcuffs past shocked employees and customers. The man who had built his reputation on Marcus's grave was finally facing justice for his crimes. The local media coverage was intense. Jerome had become a prominent figure in New Orleans' culinary scene, his restaurants featured in travel magazines and food television shows. The revelation that he'd murdered his business partner sent shockwaves through the tight-knit restaurant community. Fellow chefs who had admired Jerome's success felt sickened by the knowledge that it was built on blood money. Sophia Williams, now a 23-year-old elementary school teacher, struggled with conflicting emotions as she watched Jerome's arrest on the evening news. He taught me how to make roux when I was 12, she told her mother. He said my father would have been proud of how well I stirred it. How do you process something like that? How do you reconcile the man who was kind to you with the man who killed your father? The Williams family's ordeal was far from over. Jerome's arrest meant there would be a trial, requiring them to relive the worst period of their lives in excruciating detail. The defense would likely argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that 15 years had passed, that Jerome's confession in his journal could be interpreted as fiction or fantasy. But Detective Champagne was confident in her case. The DNA evidence, the financial records, the journal entries, and the timeline all pointed to the same conclusion. Jerome Baptiste had murdered Marcus Williams in cold blood and spent 15 years profiting from his crime. If this case has already gripped you, hit the like button. It helps Marcus Williams' story reach more people. The truth that Marcus had died trying to expose was finally coming to light, but for the Williams family, the hardest part was yet to come. Facing Jerome Baptiste in a courtroom and demanding justice for the husband and father whose trust had been so brutally betrayed. Jerome had gambled that his secret would stay buried forever. He'd been wrong. The truth, like the mighty Mississippi River that flows through New Orleans, has a way of surfacing eventually, carrying away the lies and leaving only the stark reality of what really happened on that October night in 2007. The Orleans Parish Courthouse buzzed with anticipation on the morning of March 15, 2023, as Jerome Baptiste's murder trial began. For the Williams family, this moment represented the culmination of 15 years of unanswered questions and the hope that justice might finally be served for Marcus's death. District Attorney Jennifer Roussel had built her case methodically, presenting a timeline that painted Jerome as a calculating killer who had murdered his best friend to cover up his theft. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. Jerome Baptiste stole from Marcus Williams for 2 years. When Marcus discovered the theft, Jerome lured him to an abandoned house and murdered him. Everything that happened afterward, the fake grief, the financial support for the family, the preservation of Marcus's office, was an elaborate performance designed to hide his guilt. Jerome's defense attorney, Thomas Hebert, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming. DNA proof, financial records, and most damaging of all, Jerome's own journal entries documenting both the theft and the murder. Hebert's strategy focused on attacking the timeline and suggesting that the journal entries were creative writing rather than confession. "My client is a chef, not a killer," Hebert argued. "Jerome Baptiste loved Marcus Williams like a brother. The prosecution wants you to believe that a man would kill his best friend, comfort his widow, help raise his children, and maintain his memorial office for 15 years, all while maintaining perfect composure. That's not human behavior. That's the plot of a psychological thriller." But as the trial progressed, witness after witness painted a picture of Jerome's guilt. Maria Santos, the forensic accountant, methodically explained how Jerome had used his great-aunt's identity to steal nearly $200,000 from Creole Dreams. Dr. Patricia Fontenot testified about the blood spatter evidence found on Marcus's notebook, indicating close contact violence. Most powerfully, Detective Champagne read excerpts from Jerome's journal to a silent courtroom. Angela Williams took the stand on the trial's 4th day, her testimony a devastating portrait of 15 years of manipulated grief. She described how Jerome had inserted himself into every aspect of their family's life after Marcus disappeared. Always helpful, always supportive, always maintaining the fiction that he was as devastated by the loss as they were. "He would call me on Marcus's birthday every year," Angela testified, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'd say, 'I know this is a hard day for you, Angela. Marcus would want you to know you're not alone. I thought he was being kind. Now I know he was just making sure I wasn't suspicious.'" The most dramatic moment came when prosecutors played a recording of Jerome's police interview from July 2022, shortly after Marcus's belongings were discovered. In the recording, Jerome's voice grows increasingly agitated as Detective Champagne presses him about the financial irregularities and the phone call he made to Marcus on the night of the disappearance. "You don't understand," Jerome could be heard saying on the recording. "Marcus was my best friend. I would never hurt him. When he disappeared, I lost everything too. The restaurant, our dreams, our friendship, it all died with him." The jury listened to those words knowing that Jerome's journal told a very different story. The defense called character witnesses who testified to Jerome's generosity and community involvement. Fellow chefs described him as passionate and dedicated. Charity organizations praised his fundraising efforts. His ex-wife, divorced 3 years earlier, testified that she'd never seen any signs of violence or deception in their 12-year marriage. But the prosecution's rebuttal was swift and merciless. They pointed out that Jerome's charitable work had begun only after Marcus's disappearance, as if he were trying to buy his way into heaven. They noted that his generosity to the Williams family could be seen as guilt rather than kindness. Most tellingly, they presented evidence that Jerome had used stolen money from Creole Dreams to fund some of his charitable contributions. Jerome himself never took the stand, a decision that likely saved him from further incriminating himself, but left many questions unanswered. The jury never heard his voice explaining how his DNA ended up on Marcus's blood-stained notebook, why he'd documented the theft and murder in his journal, or how he'd managed to live with his guilt for 15 years. On March 28, 2023, after deliberating for just 6 hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder and theft by fraud. Jerome Baptiste, the man who had built a culinary empire on his best friend's grave, would spend the rest of his life in prison. The Williams family embraced in the courthouse hallway as reporters captured the moment they'd waited 15 years to experience. Justice had finally been served, but the victory felt hollow. Marcus was still gone. 15 years of their lives had been stolen along with his. Michael would never know his father. Sophia would never have her daddy walk her down the aisle. Jerome Baptiste was led away in shackles, his face expressionless as he faced the consequences of his choices. The man who had murdered Marcus Williams to protect his secret had finally run out of places to hide. The truth, as Marcus had written in his final notebook entry, had indeed been in the numbers, and now those numbers had told their story in a court of law. For the Williams family, the trial's end marked not just the conclusion of a legal process, but the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. They could finally stop looking over their shoulders, stop wondering if Marcus might somehow still be alive, stop carrying the weight of unanswered questions. The ghost of Marcus Williams could finally rest in peace, his murder solved, and his killer brought to justice. But the scars left by 15 years of uncertainty would take much longer to heal. The sentencing hearing for Jerome Baptiste took place on a humid April morning in 2023, 6 months after his arrest and just weeks after his conviction. Judge Margaret Dufresne's courtroom was packed with members of New Orleans' culinary community, many of whom had worked alongside Jerome for years, without suspecting the dark secret he carried. Before imposing sentence, Judge Dufresne allowed victim impact statements from the Williams family. Angela Williams, now 51, but looking older after 15 years of carrying an unbearable burden, approached the podium with steady steps that belied the tremor in her voice. "Your Honor, Jerome Baptiste didn't just kill my husband," Angela began, her words cutting through the courtroom's silence like a blade. "He killed our family's future. He stole 15 years of birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and quiet Sunday mornings. He robbed my children of their father and me of my best friend. But perhaps most cruelly, he made us grateful for his help while he knew exactly why we needed it." Sophia Williams, now 24 and bearing a striking resemblance to her father, spoke next. Her teacher's training had prepared her to speak publicly, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment. "I used to pray every night that my daddy would come home," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Jerome would pat my head and say, 'Don't lose hope, sweetheart.' He knew my daddy was never coming home because he's the one who made sure of it." Michael Williams, at 16, chose to read a letter he'd written to the father he'd never known. "Dear Dad, I finally know what happened to you. I know you didn't leave us on purpose. I know you fought to come home to us. I promise to live the kind of life that would make you proud. And I promise that your name will be remembered for who you really were, not for how your story ended." The impact on New Orleans' restaurant industry had been seismic. 3 establishments bearing Jerome's name had closed within weeks of his arrest, their reputations tainted by association with murder. Dozens of employees found themselves unemployed, victims of their former boss's crimes. The Louisiana Restaurant Association launched an investigation into Jerome's business practices, uncovering additional financial irregularities that suggested the theft from Creole Dreams was just the beginning. Most devastating was the revelation that Jerome had used his ill-gotten gains to fund his expansion into the New Orleans restaurant scene. The success that had made him a local celebrity was built entirely on blood money, stolen from his murdered best friend. Every award he'd won, every accolade he'd received, every charitable contribution he'd made, all of it was tainted by Marcus Williams's blood. Dr. Sarah Melanson, a forensic psychologist who had studied the case, testified about Jerome's psychological profile during the sentencing hearing. "Mr. Baptiste exhibits classic traits of a psychopathic personality," she explained. "His ability to maintain close relationships with his victim's family while concealing his guilt for 15 years demonstrates an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization and emotional manipulation." The prosecution revealed additional evidence that hadn't been necessary for conviction, but painted an even darker picture of Jerome's calculated cruelty. Phone records showed that Jerome had called Angela Williams on the first anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, offering to take her and the children to dinner at Creole Dreams. He'd suggested they sit at Marcus's favorite table to honor his memory. Perhaps most chilling was security footage from 2018, when Marcus was finally declared legally dead. The video showed Jerome attending the memorial service at St. Louis Cathedral, embracing Angela Williams and her children, accepting condolences from the community, and delivering a tearful eulogy about his beloved friend and business partner. The performance was flawless, worthy of an Academy Award. Judge Dufresne's sentencing was swift and unforgiving. "Jerome Baptiste, you have been convicted of one of the most heinous crimes this court has seen," she announced. "You murdered your best friend, your business partner, and the father of 2 young children, but your crime didn't end with Marcus Williams's death. For 15 years, you have tortured his family with false hope and manipulated their grief for your own purposes. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 20 years for the theft charges. At 42, Jerome Baptiste would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his culinary empire reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale about greed and betrayal. As Jerome was led away in shackles, he turned one last time to look at the Williams family. Angela met his gaze unflinchingly, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and profound sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't restore what had been lost. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind only the echoes of 15 years of pain finally given voice. The Williams family walked into the New Orleans sunshine, free at last from the shadow that had hung over their lives since that October night in 2007. But freedom, they were learning, was not the same as healing. The man who had killed Marcus Williams was finally paying for his crime, but the wounds he'd inflicted on a family and a community would take much longer to mend. 6 months after Jerome Baptiste's sentencing, the Williams family began the difficult process of rebuilding their lives, with the truth finally revealed. The weight of 15 years of uncertainty had been lifted, but in its place came a different kind of grief, mourning not just for Marcus, but for the years of their lives that had been stolen along with him. Creole Dreams, the restaurant that had been both Marcus's dream and the scene of his betrayal, faced an uncertain future. The building's owner had terminated Jerome's lease immediately after his arrest, and the space sat empty for months, while the community debated what should become of it. Some argued it should be demolished, too tainted by association with murder to ever serve food again. Others believed it should be preserved as a monument to Marcus's culinary vision. The decision ultimately came from an unexpected source: the Williams family themselves. Using the life insurance money that had finally been released after Jerome's conviction, along with donations from the New Orleans culinary community, Angela Williams purchased the building and announced plans to reopen it as Marcus's Kitchen, a non-profit restaurant that would train underprivileged youth in culinary arts while preserving her husband's recipes and legacy. "My husband believed that food brought people together," Angela explained to the Times-Picayune during the restaurant's renovation. "He would want his death to mean something positive. If we can help kids who might otherwise fall through the cracks, if we can teach them the skills Marcus learned and loved, then maybe some good can come from all this tragedy." Sophia Williams had thrown herself into the project, taking a leave of absence from teaching to help design the training program. She'd discovered a talent for organization and administration that reminded Angela painfully of Marcus's attention to detail. "Daddy always said cooking was about more than just following recipes," Sophia told volunteers. "He said it was about patience, creativity, and caring for people. That's what we want to teach here." Michael Williams, now a junior in high school, had begun working in the kitchen after school and on weekends. His natural aptitude for cooking was uncanny. He could taste a dish and instinctively know what it needed, just as his father had been able to do. Angela watched her son work and saw Marcus in every gesture, every focused expression, every moment of culinary inspiration. The restaurant's opening in October 2023, exactly 16 years after Marcus's disappearance, was a community celebration that drew hundreds of people. Local chefs who had known and respected Marcus donated their time to help serve the opening night dinner. Mayor LaToya Cantrell spoke about the importance of turning tragedy into hope. The event raised over $50,000 for the restaurant's youth training program. Jerome Baptiste's former empire had crumbled completely. His 3 restaurants remained shuttered, their equipment sold at auction to pay legal fees and restitution to victims of his various financial schemes. Investigators had discovered that the theft from Creole Dreams was just one part of a larger pattern of fraud that had victimized multiple business partners and investors over the years. The Louisiana Restaurant Association had implemented new financial oversight requirements for multi-location restaurant groups, reforms that became known informally as Marcus's Law. The changes required independent auditing of restaurant finances and background checks for partners with access to business accounts. It was a small step toward preventing future tragedies, but an important one. Dr. Patricia Fontenot, the coroner who had analyzed the blood evidence, reflected on the case's impact during a conference on cold case investigations. The Marcus Williams case demonstrates the importance of never giving up on seeking justice, she told her audience. 15 years is a long time, but it's never too long for the truth to matter. Science gave us the tools to solve this crime, but it was the family's refusal to give up hope that kept the case alive. Detective Lisa Champagne had been promoted to sergeant partly based on her work solving the Williams case. She kept a photo of Marcus Williams on her desk as a reminder that every cold case represented a real person whose life had been cut short and a family waiting for answers. You can't solve them all, she told younger detectives, but you have to try to solve everyone. The impact on New Orleans' tight-knit culinary community had been profound. The revelation that one of their most successful members was a killer had shaken everyone's faith in the bonds of professional friendship. But it had also brought the community closer together, united in their determination to honor Marcus's memory and support his family. Celebrity chef Emeril Lagasse, who had known Marcus personally, established a scholarship fund in his name for aspiring chefs from low-income families. Marcus Williams represented the best of what New Orleans cooking is about, Lagasse said during the scholarship announcement. He deserves to be remembered for his talent and his passion, not for how his life ended. The Williams family had also established the Marcus Williams Foundation, dedicated to supporting families of violent crime victims. Angela's experience navigating 15 years of uncertainty had taught her how inadequate the support systems were for families in similar situations. The foundation provided counseling services, legal assistance, and financial support for families whose loved ones had been murdered or had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. As 2023 drew to a close, the Williams family found themselves in a strange position, grateful for justice, but still learning how to live with closure. For 15 years, they had defined themselves by Marcus's absence. Now they had to rediscover who they were, with the truth finally known. The healing would take time, perhaps years more, but for the first time since that October night in 2007, Angela Williams could look toward the future with something approaching hope. Marcus was gone, but his legacy would live on through the restaurant bearing his name, the young people learning his recipes, and the family that had never stopped believing he deserved justice. 2 years after Jerome Baptiste's conviction, the Williams family gathered at Marcus's grave in Metairie Cemetery for what had become an annual tradition. But this year was different. For the first time since Marcus's disappearance, they weren't coming to ask questions or plead for answers. They were coming to share news of a life being lived in his honor. The headstone, finally installed after years of legal complications, bore a simple inscription: Marcus Williams, beloved husband, father, chef. His recipes live on in the hearts he touched. Below that, a quote from Marcus's own writings: good food like truth has a way of bringing people together. Michael Williams, now 18 and preparing for culinary school, placed a wooden spoon at the base of the headstone, the same type Marcus had used to teach him to make roux during their brief time together before his disappearance. I got accepted to Johnson & Wales, Dad, Michael said quietly. Mom says you would have been proud. Sophia Williams, now 25 and newly engaged to a fellow teacher she'd met at Marcus's kitchen, had brought her fiancé to meet the father he'd never have the chance to know in person. David wants to learn to make your jambalaya for the wedding reception, she told the headstone. I told him you'd appreciate a man who understands that the secret is in the patience. Angela Williams had aged gracefully through her ordeal, her hair now silver, but her spirit stronger than it had been in decades. She carried a folder of letters from young people who had graduated from Marcus's Kitchens training program. 27 kids have found jobs in restaurants because of you, she told her husband's grave. 3 of them are opening their own places next year. Your recipe for hope is still working. The true crime documentary about Marcus's case had aired on Investigation Discovery the previous month, bringing national attention to both the murder and the family's journey toward justice. The program, titled The Chef Who Knew Too Much, had been carefully crafted with the Williams family's full cooperation. They wanted Marcus's story told accurately, not sensationalized for entertainment. The documentary had generated hundreds of emails from viewers, many of them families dealing with their own unsolved cases. Angela had read every letter, responding personally to those who shared similar experiences. The Marcus Williams Foundation had received donations from across the country, allowing them to expand their services to help families in other states. Jerome Baptiste remained in Louisiana State Penitentiary, where he was serving his life sentence in relative anonymity. Prison records indicated he spent most of his time in his cell, reading cooking magazines and writing what guards described as recipes and food memoirs. He had refused all interview requests from journalists and documentary producers, maintaining his silence just as completely as he had maintained his lies for 15 years. Dr. Sarah Melançon, the forensic psychologist who had testified at Jerome's sentencing, had published a case study about the murder in the Journal of Forensic Psychology. Her research focused on the psychological mechanisms that allowed perpetrators to maintain close relationships with their victims' families while concealing their guilt. The Marcus Williams case had become a textbook example of criminal psychology. Detective Lisa Champagne, now a lieutenant in the NOPD's cold case unit, had used the Williams investigation as a model for approaching other long-dormant cases. The combination of modern forensic techniques and persistent family advocacy had proven effective in solving 3 additional murders that had gone unsolved for over a decade. Marcus Williams taught us that cases are never really cold, she often told her officers. They're just waiting for the right moment to tell their story. The New Orleans culinary scene had slowly healed from the shock of Jerome's crimes. Marcus's Kitchen had become one of the city's most respected training programs, with graduates working in restaurants throughout the South. The program's success had inspired similar initiatives in other cities, spreading Marcus's philosophy that cooking was about more than just preparing food. It was about building community and creating opportunity. The annual Marcus Williams Memorial Cook-Off had become a major fundraising event for the foundation, drawing celebrity chefs and food enthusiasts from around the country. This year's event had raised over $200,000, enough to fund the foundation's operations for an entire year and provide college scholarships for a dozen aspiring chefs from low-income families. As the family prepared to leave the cemetery, Angela Williams felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for 2 decades. The questions that had haunted her for 15 years had been answered. The man who had killed her husband was paying for his crime. Marcus's legacy was secure, preserved not in stone or bronze, but in the lives he continued to touch through his recipes, his restaurant, and his family's determination to turn tragedy into hope. The story of Marcus Williams was no longer just about a chef who had disappeared on a rainy October night. It was about the power of truth to survive even the most carefully constructed lies, about the strength of family bonds in the face of unimaginable loss, and about the way love and memory can transform grief into something larger than itself. Michael Williams would graduate from culinary school and eventually take over Marcus's Kitchen. Sophia Williams would marry her teacher, raise children who would grow up hearing stories about their grandfather, the chef. Angela Williams would continue advocating for families of crime victims, turning her own experience of loss into a source of strength for others. And in the bustling kitchens of New Orleans, in the teaching kitchen of Marcus's restaurant, in the pages of cookbooks and the memories of friends, Marcus Williams's recipes would continue to nourish bodies and souls, ensuring that his greatest creation, a legacy of love served with every meal, would endure long after the headlines faded and the courtroom dramas ended. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases across America. Thank you for following Marcus Williams's story. We'll see you in the next video.